to the top. And so it's a great little animation, but waiting for, like if Dave or John had to always constantly wait for Brent to manipulate the timing curves and things like that, it would have been a much longer development process for them. But the limitation of implementation like this is that typically you're going to have quite a bit of your application built to be able to support a framework like this. And that framework may or may not be something that you can move from application to application. And so the third class of prototyping tools is what Pascal De Silva, again, calls signal flow-based prototyping tools. And this is where Quartz Composer and Origami come into play, because these signal flow tools are now interactive. So they allow you to interactively manipulate your prototype, and they can also be manipulated by the user so they can interact with it just as if they were using your actual application. And the kind of resurgence of Quartz Composer and Origami as prototyping tools was kind of started by all of the work that was going on at Facebook with the development of their Facebook phone that had the home interface, and more recently with Paper. And you know, Paper has, okay, sorry about that. Paper has these really unique animations, if you haven't seen it before, where the user can interact with the content. They can slide content up. They can gesture with it. They have these nice flip animations where the content opens up and it reveals the content within the web page. Everything is very gestural based, so as the user is manipulating things, it's very reactive, very performant to the touch with the user. They've got this great card interface for ordering the different parts of your news timeline. And all of this was prototyped using Origami, which is a kind of collection of patches that they created for Quartz Composer. And we'll get into the details of how you use Quartz Composer in a minute. But all of the work that they put into this, they very generously released that to the public. And I've found that by using a combination of Quartz Composer and Origami, that it's kind of opened up the designers on our teams to build some really some great concepts that they can then show to me and kind of get my feedback as to whether that's achievable or if it's something that we could get into the application. All right, so if you're not familiar with Quartz Composer, it's a free tool that's been available for quite a while from Apple. You can download it from the developer site. It's part of a bundle of graphics tools, and it was, I think the most recent release was the late fall of last year. So although it's not like one of the more apps that they mention that often, it is something that they're still slowly maintaining, and perhaps with this resurgence of using Quartz Composer among the design community, there might be some additional updates and make it a little bit more, bring it up to speed with more modern OS X interfaces. So if you've never seen Quartz Composer before, it's this visual design tool where you're building up these compositions by wiring what's called patches together. And patches are these individual components that perform some very specific piece of logic. And that could be things like capturing input from the mouse or keyboard. It could be rendering images to the screen. And then there are also patches that perform, that generate output for animation or for timing curves that you can use for animations. There are also patches that perform logic, so you could have mathematical expressions or simple conditional expressions where you're just comparing two values and want a true-false type of result. And so it's very easy to get into because it's very interactive, and you're just dragging these connections, output from one patch to the input of another patch. And I wasn't that familiar with Quartz Composer until I started reading more about the using it as an interaction prototyping tool. And the first time I started using it, it immediately brought this into my mind. And so anybody who grew up in the 70s like me knows about these electronics project kits where you had all of these like little resistors and transistors and things laid out, and you had a variety of ways to wire them up together to produce some kind of result, whether you were lighting up the LEDs or making cool little waveform sounds from the speaker. And so when I saw that although the interface for Quartz Composer is pretty different than what you're used to, I think it very closely kind of maps to this analogy of like wiring up a circuit board to produce a result at the end. And you can change the output simply by removing the wire from one connection and connecting it to another, or changing values within a patch. So it's very interactive because you can very quickly, by manipulating those values, you can very quickly build up to the prototype that you're trying to create. And so, like I said, it's this great visual programming tool, and so it's not linear like Flash or After Effects, because it's constantly, your compositions are constantly running, so as you're making changes to it, they're immediately reflected in the viewer window. And there's nothing to compile, there's no code, so you don't have to worry about, making some changes, compiling it, fixing syntax errors and things like that. It's all right there in the tool, running as you're building it. And because of that, it allows for very rapid and interactive prototyping. So you can change timing curves for your animation on the fly and manipulate and very quickly see the results of those changes as you are manipulating the patches. All right, so far I've given you all the great things and all the reasons why you should be using Quartz Composer. This is where I kind of take a step back and let you know there are a couple of catches that you got to be aware of. So first up, Quartz Composer was not originally intended to be used as a pixel-perfect prototyping design tool. It was created for these visual graphics animations, and so the coordinate system that you get out of the box with Quartz Composer is unit-based, not pixel-based. And so the coordinate system scales to match the size of your viewport. So the middle of the screen is 0, 0, and -1, 0 is going to be on the far left, and 1, 0 will be on the far right. And when you're creating prototypes, you want it to be pixel perfect because you're going to be pulling in graphics files and images and things, and you want to be able to position them based on pixels because that's the most natural way of doing that. And getting over this unit to pixels hump is something that Origami provides for you. So all the patches that you use with Origami are all pixel based, and it takes care of all the behind the scenes of converting those pixel coordinates into the unit coordinates that Quartz Composer wants to use. The other issue you'll run into is kind of the literal and visual embodiment of spaghetti code. So if you're using Quartz Composer out of the box, there are no patches that are really directly mapped to kind of the vocabulary or the domain language that you would want to use for creating prototypes. So you kind of have to reinvent the wheel every time. And as a result, your compositions could get pretty complex and get hard to follow. And sharing compositions from one person to another, they might implement scrolling a different way. So you don't have that common kind of pattern-based vocabulary that somebody looking at your composition can immediately realize, oh, these are the patches that handle scrolling for a particular area. They've got to decipher everything that's going on within your composition. And that's what's so great about Origami, because it addresses these two issues directly. It provides for a way to always focus on pixels as your coordinate system, and it creates a common vocabulary. So the Origami was released as a prototyping toolkit for Quartz Composer by the Facebook design team, and they released it as a result of all the work they did on prototyping the paper app. And so as you can see, even if a lot of you may not even be familiar with Quartz Composer, you could probably look at this list of patch names and pretty quickly grasp what some of these patches are going to be responsible for doing. It's really great. So when it comes to scrolling content, you just use a patch called a scroll patch. You have patches that will handle the skinning of your application and placing it within like an iPhone skin or an Android skin. It allows for landscape and portrait modes. You've got things for handling placing images on the screen and manipulating the transitions between those images. You've got patches that can represent buttons and text labels. So for when it comes to building your compositions, if you use Quartz Composer, then it makes your compositions much more understandable by the rest of your team. Okay, so let's build a prototype. So I've got this design that my designer sent me for Spybook, which is a social network for covert agents. And it's got a typical kind of timeline feed. And And what they want to do is as the user scrolls through the timeline and scrolls up, they want that toolbar to animate and move behind the title bar. And when the user scrolls back down, it should reappear. And then likewise, when the user goes to post a status, they want the status to kind of pop in and kind of animate in with a nice scaling effect. So these are the things that we're going to implement within Quartz Composer. In order to do this, I've been presented with the following kind of pixel-perfect mock-up of what they want the UI to look like. And I asked them to provide me with enough content in the feed so I would have enough content to scroll, because this is a screen that the user is going to be scrolling things. So I'm going to decompose this into the pieces I need to manipulate independently. So first, I'm going to extract the image I'm going to use for the feed. I'm going to pull out the header. And I'm going to pull out the toolbar. And then finally, I'm also going to need something to put on the screen for the status form. And of course, when you're typing in the status update, you're going to need a keyboard. So I'm going to animate in a keyboard as well, even though that wasn't in the original mock-up. I'm going to quickly go through a tour of the Quartz Composer UI in case you're not already familiar with it. So this is what Quartz Composer looks like when you're using it. On the left side, you've got your editor window where you wire together your patches. On the right side, you have your viewer, which is constantly running and producing the output of your composition. When you're pulling in patches, you're going to bring up what's called the patch library window, and this lets you search for patches by their name and drag and drop them into the editor. And then finally, to manipulate the properties of a patch, you've got an inspector window, and then you can bring that up by selecting a patch and hitting Command-I. And then that lets you manipulate the properties and also view the properties as your composition is running. Now, like I mentioned, there are thousands of patches out there, so it's very easy to get overwhelmed with some of this. But my animation got really messed up there. But for the purposes of this composition, we're only going to use about 11 patches. For the rendering, we're going to have the phone and phone dimensions patch to produce the skin for the output. We'll use a layer group to compose all the images together into the final scrolling image. We'll use some image patches to put images on the screen. For capturing input, we're going to use a scroll patch and then an interaction patch to capture when the user taps on the status button. We're going to also need some logic to control when elements show up on the screen. And for those, we're going to use a switch, and the switch is going to be used to toggle the status message onto the screen. And a conditional will be used to determine when the toolbar should show up or be hidden behind the title bar. And then to implement animations, we're going to use what's called classic or bouncy animations. These are going to implement this kind of timing curves that you're used to in iOS. And the transitions are kind of an interpolation patch that allow you to specify a start and end value, and then based on a progress value you apply in, it's going to compute some kind of interpolation value between those two. Okay, so let's jump into Quartz Composer and build this. All right. So because of timing constraints and everything, instead of having to drag in all of the patches from the patch library, I've already got a few of them laid out on the screen. Let me zoom in so y'all can see this a little bit better. Hopefully the resolution is good enough that you can see it. So the phone and phone dimensions patch are what provide the output for this iPhone skin showing up on the left-hand side. And these I can change, so if I wanted to, I could change it to say an Android skin or a Windows Phone skin or even an iPad skin. And as you can see in the viewer window, it's automatically changed that, although my assets aren't sized correctly for those. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to do the iPhone skin. And also to make it a little bit more easy to see, I'm going to change the viewer to full screen so that you don't even have to see that iPhone image around it, so you can see the content that's on the window. Okay, the layer group is just like layers within Photoshop. So as you're combining images together, it's going to take all those images and produce a final composite image, and that's what shows up in in the phone feed on the right side. So let me turn some of these off, just so we can. All right. So I've pulled in a image for my header right here, and if I look at the inspector window for that, I can see it's positioned at the top of the screen. I'm using an anchor point of the top left, and this is going to be positioned on the screen at all times. So I don't have to worry. Once I put that on the screen, I don't have to worry about actually manipulating the position of that again. Next, I've got my the feed for my image, or sorry, the image for my my news feed. And so right now, this image is bigger than can fit on the screen, but when I'm clicking on it, nothing's happening. I can't actually scroll it. So what I'm going to do here is use this scroll patch. And with the scroll patch, it's a combination of an interaction patch that it'll capture the input that the user is giving with the mouse, and I'm going to assign that to the layer that's outputting the image from my scroll feed. And then I'm going to take the Y position that's produced by the scrolling patch, and now it's going to change the Y position of the feed. And if I bring up the patch inspector for that, you can see that the Y position is changing as I scroll. And so that's how you're getting this effect of actually scrolling. So next up, I want to figure out how I can get the status bar, or sorry, the toolbar to appear on the screen. So let me enable that image. So we can see that, so right now it's positioned at the top down 128 pixels so that it positions itself below my, my title bar. And essentially what I want to do is I want the Y position to alternate between this -128 and -44 so that it kind of hides itself behind the title bar. But I certainly don't want to sit here and type those values in every time I want the title to, or the toolbar to move. I want that to be happen interactively. So I'm going to use this transition patch to move between those two values. So if I assign the output of that as the Y position, we can see that this is going to say, okay, when progress is 0, the Y position that or the value it produces is going to be -40. But if my value is all the way at 1, it's going to produce -128. If I put 0.5, which would be halfway in between, you would see that as that progress value changes, it's going to be producing values that will slowly or quickly move that toolbar behind the title bar. But of course, I don't want that transition to happen immediately. I want it to happen with a nice animation. And that's where this classic animation patch comes into play. And so the animation patch is going to basically, I can move it from 0 to 1, and as soon as I give it 1, it's going to produce output values that match the timing curve of a quadratic in-out curve. So I could change it to something else, but the quadratic in-out curve is something that more closely matches what you're used to with the ease-in, ease-out animations in iOS. And so now, if I manipulate the input number for this patch, we'll see that that toolbar is animating in and out. But it's animating in and out a bit too slowly for my taste. So I'm going to change the duration of that patch to be, let's say, 0.4 seconds. So now when it animates in and out, I think it's much snappier, and I think it's going to match more closely to the scrolling. So now we've got our patch animating in and out, and we need to figure out a way to tie that to the scroll position. So when the user, basically as soon as the user scrolls past this threshold right here, so when the content of my feed is going to touch that toolbar, I want that toolbar to disappear behind the title bar. And for that, I'm going to use this conditional patch. And the conditional patch is the way that you would implement simple, if-then statements in Quartz Composer. And to figure out the values that we want to use for that, let's look at the feed patch details. So as I'm scrolling, you'll notice that the Y position of my feed patch, or my feed image changes. And when it's kind of at rest at the top, the Y position is around negative 580, and about when it hits, say, negative 560, that's when I think I'm hitting the threshold that should determine when the toolbar should either be hidden or shown. So when my Y position is less than, say, negative 560, I want the toolbar to show. But if it's greater than negative 560, I want the toolbar to hide. And so that's what this conditional patch is set up for right now. So it's going to compare the first value that I'm applying to it, and if it's lower than that value, it's going to return 1. And that's just saying, am I scrolled? Is the user scrolled to the top? And I can quickly test that by combining taking the output of my conditional and tying it into the number of the input for the classic animation. And so now when my conditional, so let's change this to say, I don't know, negative 100. So now my condition fails because it is not lower than negative 570. That produces a result of 0, which throws a 0 into the animation patch. If I now change this back to negative 580, we'll see that my condition is true, and it'll bring that toolbar back into view. So finally, all I'm left to do is tie the Y position to this input value of my scroll patch. And now as... Oh, I moved the wrong one. Sorry. There we go. So now as I scroll up and down through the image, we'll see that the toolbar is appearing and showing based on that. So I'll have the final composition up online, and I'll show you how I wired up the status as well. And go back to because we're running a little short on time here. So before I go, let me throw out some resources for you to Google. I'm not going to give you like URLs to look up, but let me give you some things to look up on Google. So Facebook Origami, the concept of transitional interfaces. There's another patch toolkit that IDEO released called Avocado. And then there's also just searching on UX prototyping, and you'll find out a lot about this. Some people to look up online for more advice. The people at Facebook that released this, there's Julie Zoe, Drew Hamlin, and Brandon Walkden worked pretty heavily on the Origami toolkit. Then finally, the concept of transitional interfaces is something that kind of brought me into this whole realm of interaction prototyping. And Pascal de Silva was somebody who kind of was kind of a pioneer in that area. So certainly go look up some of the work he's done on Medium. And Dave O'Brien is someone who's also done a lot of work when it comes to showing people how to create compositions using Quartz Composer. All right, so here's my contact information. If you have any questions for me, I'm going to have I'll have slides from this presentation up on my website under the Talks page. I'm also going to be working in the labs this afternoon. I won't be running a lab, but I'll be there helping out. So if you see me and you have some questions about Quartz Composer or Origami, feel free to track me down. Thanks so much for coming out this morning. I really appreciate it. Yes? Mm-hmm. You can. And
we actually don't have any time for questions. I'm so sorry. But you should go to the lab. So we're just going to take a couple minutes, and then the next speaker will be on.